you ladies in a moment, but first, as we've just seen the film, I'm going to turn to the director of the film, Sky Fitzgerald. Sky, thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this conversation and for giving your time beyond just making the film to have these discussions. I think probably for the audience who are joining us for the discussion, like me and anyone I'm sure who's seen the film, it's a profound, poignant, moving film, and it's hard to make that transition immediately to this discussion. But it really does show the devastating impact of war for the people on the ground. And of course, there are many conflicts in the world right now. You chose for this film to cover what's happening in Yemen from the perspective of these hospitals doing their best to save the next generation, which we know are under threat. You know, almost half are faced with the possibility of starvation, imminent starvation, hence the hashtag Yemen can't wait. Why Yemen, and did you find, Sky, what you were expecting to see despite all your preparation? How much of a shock did it come to you?
Well, I guess first, Saima, I wish there weren't a need to do a film like Hunger Ward. That would be my greatest wish, that in the future there isn't a need for a film like this. And you know, we were talking earlier a little bit about how Hunger Ward sadly does fit into this historical context, right? Where, you know, people hear that there's a human caused famine, and, you know, they kind of shake their head, and they, at least here in America, people think, where's Yemen? And yet there is precedent for what's happening there right now. You can go all the way back to post-World War II, when Nazi Germany actively and intentionally starved so much of Europe, and led to hundreds of thousands of deaths of children. And that's exactly what's happening right now in Yemen, primarily through Saudi Arabia's blockade of the country. So for me personally, when I learned about that as a filmmaker, I want to say deeply moved, but it was mostly horrified. And I felt that as an American whose government is supporting this crime against children, I wanted to do what I could to bring it to light. So I'd done all this research, and you know, before you go into the field, as you know, you have a conception, of course, of what you will find, and sometimes that conception sort of marries well with the reality you discover, and sometimes it doesn't. In this case, in some ways it did, because I'd been in such good communication with the facilities before we arrived. So I already had a lot of dialogue back and forth, and I was not prepared for the volume of children coming through the clinic and the hospital, nor for the sort of how close to death so many of them were. That's what surprised me, is I thought that they wouldn't be as deep, in such deep and chronic states of severe acute malnutrition as so many of the children were. So that surprised me. I thought it would be a trickle rather than a stream, and it was really a stream of these children, this entire generation, that were really at risk of death because of lack of food.
And of course, you have to build relationships with the people on the ground that you you want to be able to access these very extraordinary moments, because if you don't film them, how will people know? And I as an international correspondent, am very aware of that situation. And if you need that sense of trust, how did you build that up with them?
Whew, time. It took a lot of time, and that's as it should be. You know, I often, because the context is so challenging. You're not only being sort of conflict zone, but within these facilities, you know, these are people's lives at stake, and you know, Dr. Al-Sadiq and Nurse Makia do everything they can to save every child that comes into their clinic and their hospital. And the work they're doing is so unseen, and yet in my view so absolutely heroic. And what I wanted to do, and it's what I've tried to do in this entire trilogy of films leading up to this one, is you know, really shine a light onto people who I see doing the most important work under very difficult circumstances that the world may not otherwise see. And you know, that's the agency I have as a filmmaker, is to point my camera at heroic individuals who are actually making a difference. And you know, on my limited time on this planet, those are the people I want to try to lift up. And Makia and Aida are, in my view, two of those people who are doing this very quiet, absolutely vital work to ensure that this generation of children, sort of, that has been so deeply affected by the war, survive and can thrive beyond the war.
Yeah, I know we were discussing that a lot of discussions with directors and you know, Oscar nominated films is often about the process of making the film and focusing on you as the filmmaker. I want to focus on you as the human being, as a father, as an American man, actually, as we know America's involvement in the war. How did it affect you, both when you were there in the field and, as I know all too well, when you come back and you have time to absorb it? And of course, we come back to the privilege and comfort of our own homes and safety and security. Can you tell me how it impacted you emotionally and psychologically?
Yeah, and I'll start by just saying that, you know, we try not to be a presence in the film, because that's not the story we're trying to tell. And so I try to, as much as I can, deflect those questions, like the question you just asked, because no matter what I faced as a storyteller and as a filmmaker,
Of
it's
course.
nothing compared to what Aida and Makia and the families we worked with face in the clinics. So that said, I will answer your question, and that's that. Yeah, it takes a toll. I'd be lying to say it didn't. And so personally, you know, you know, it's not an easy thing to see the work that Aida and Makia have to do, or to see a mother grieve over a lost child. And so I really unpacked it when I came home as much as anything else, because as we went through the footage and started to edit it, you know, we watched these families grieve over and over again. And that resonated with me as a human being, as a dad, as you noted. And I think it was very cathartic for me to try to, um, it motivated me to really try to tell this story that we'd been given such incredible access to, um, with as much dignity as possible, and as we thought the families, as they told us, wanted us to tell it as well.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think you said to me, as an American, it made you angry, and that's why you want to make sure that the film has an impact, in that something is done about this.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. The process of shooting the film, the process of editing the film has been a catalytic event for me as a human being, because it's motivated me to ensure that, we put this film out as broadly as possible, because that's what we need to do to honor the work of Makia and Aida, and to honor sort of the experiences of all the families and the children that you see in the film. And we're not going to stop that process until, at least the US has altered its political stance, in the conflict in Yemen.
Skye Fitzgerald, thanks so much for joining me for this conversation. I can see now that Iman Saleh has also joined us. She, as I mentioned before, has been on hunger strike. And I'm going to turn to the rest of our panelists now, Shireen, Aisha, and Iman. Thanks so much for joining us for this discussion. Iman, I'm going to start with you. You are on, I think, day 20 of your hunger strike now. Um, you've told me that you felt your campaign was left with no choice and compelled to take this action because you have been trying and trying and trying, and you thought that this was now the only way to be heard.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, when is writing a letter enough? When is putting together a protest enough? You know, every day we lay our heads on our beds and we just think about Yemen. And I know I'm not speaking for myself here. I think I can comfortably speak for Dr. Aisha and Shireen and Jumaan and all of them. Like, when we go to sleep, all we think about is Yemen, and what can we do the next day to push that agenda.
I'm going to ask all of you this question. Aisha, perhaps if I start with you first, how and why did you get involved, and how did your movement for the relief work that you do start? Aisha, if I turn to you first.
Thank you, Saima. And yeah, when the first airstrike hit Yemen, I felt a very strong sense of injustice being committed against the Yemeni people. And that's really was my day one of realizing I have to do something about it. I cannot just sit here and cry, because that, you know, that's the emotional reaction, was just to be so devastated. But being devastated is not going to help the people of Yemen. So I started calling the people in Yemen, sending money to the areas that were hit because people weren't getting out, ensuring some funds and some items that will help them. Then I started doing public speaking. I called every group I know, and I've been in the US long enough to have developed a very strong network of allies. And I did presentations in churches, in women's groups, and everywhere, including at the University of Washington. I wrote an op-ed. I took to Twitter, which I never had used before. I went to Facebook. So I became involved in every possible way. I sent emails because I wanted people to know, because there was a deliberate blackout of what was going on in Yemen. And we were acting against multi-million dollars PR firms that were working on behalf of the Saudis and the Emiratis. So it was a lot of work. And it did feel, at the beginning, I felt extremely alone because I remember doing a presentation at the Rotary Club, and there were people there who disputed what I was presenting. And I'm like, because they weren't seeing it in mainstream media. And also at the University of Washington, I had this big hall, and I was presenting, and people again thought I was biased. What I said in 2015, a lot of people are saying now.
Yeah.
Dr.
Shireen Al-Adeimi, I want to know as well, of course, how you got involved, because there you are, an assistant professor at Michigan State University. Of course, you are of Yemeni origin as well. And suddenly you find yourself advocating and talking and speaking out about the crisis. And as Aisha Jumaan's already mentioned, there was also resistance, wasn't there? Can you tell us a bit about your involvement, how you got involved, and the resistance you met?
Yeah, thank you for asking this and for facilitating this talk, this discussion. So when this started in 2015, I was a doctoral student and I was in the Boston area. And like Aisha mentioned, it just felt like this sudden helplessness. I was on my phone, checking WhatsApp to see if family members are okay after every airstrike, turning on the news and not seeing anything in mainstream sources. And so I remember a cousin years ago told me, if you want to know what's happening in the world, join Twitter. And I said, this is the day I'm going to join Twitter, and maybe I'll learn more about what's happening, because I know what my family's telling me at home. I'm just not seeing it on the news. And so I joined Twitter that day, and I started following Yemenis who are in Yemen. And I'm just trying to see what their experiences are. And I realized very early on that it was the US was involved in this war. And so I'm wondering why people weren't speaking out. And I think there was a moment where I found myself I couldn't stop crying. I just felt like so helpless and so paralyzed with devastation. And it was after watching a video of a man trying to shield his family from an airstrike in the basement. And he's telling them, don't be afraid, but his voice is cracking and you can hear the fear in his voice. And I couldn't stop crying. I just couldn't. And my husband came home from school and found me crying. And he said, you know, there's got to be something we can do. And I remember just crying and saying, well, all I can do is write. I don't have any other skills. I don't have any other connections. And he said, okay, let's sit down and write a letter. And so that's what I did. I poured my heart out in a letter. My congresswoman at the time, my senator at the time was Elizabeth Warren. And so I thought, one of the most progressive members of Congress, surely she'll be able to do something about US involvement. And I wrote her this letter. It was so well cited. I put it online on Twitter. I, included my real name for the first time because I didn't want to be anonymous. And I realized people maybe weren't used to contacting their representatives and their senators. And so I created a template of that letter and I made it publicly accessible so people could use something similar. And that's how it started. A radio station picked up my letter and my petition and wanted to hear more. And so I thought, I've spent months at the time, by then looking around, waiting for somebody to do something about this. And I realized that, I am not somebody. I should be doing something about it, instead of expecting somebody else to do it. And so I just started on this quest to educate the American public, protest, write letters. And like Aisha, I spoke at churches, at people's basements and peace centers on the streets and universities, and anyone who'll invite me, really, I'll speak to them about Yemen and educate the public about what's going on.
You've also mentioned resistance to me before, and do you want to tell us and share with the audience a bit about what kind of backlash you've faced?
I think a lot of people are used to US involvement in Middle Eastern wars. And so the idea that somebody is saying, do not intervene in this war, you're making it worse, was something that was met with a lot of negative reaction, whether it was from other Arab and Yemeni-Americans or Americans here who feel like, well, of course, the US needs to come and rescue this place that's in disarray and bring some order, as though this is not a colonial racist thing to say about a country, like it was just status quo. Of course, the US is going to go and, swoop in and do what's right. And so I had people telling me, well, I don't agree with what you're saying because it's not in the New York Times. Or, like Aisha mentioned earlier, you're biased because you're not talking about what's happening on the ground in Yemen. And I recognize that there's civil conflict in Yemen. There's lots going on in Yemen. There are lots of internal issues within Yemen. But what is the goal in highlighting that, if not to call for more intervention, which is the opposite of what I wanted to do? And so for me, it was about my own government's involvement, whether I'm Yemeni-Canadian-American, whether it was Canada or the United States, my own government's involvement in this war is what I was focused on. And that brings a lot of resistance from people who feel like, maybe we're not telling the whole story or, something like that. And I'm not a reporter, Saima. As a doctoral student, I'm an academic now. Like for me, this is as an advocate, I want to make sure that my own government is not complicit in this war. And that's what I've chosen to highlight, despite the resistance.
Yeah, you told me the US has no role there. There have been civil wars, but the destruction of, you feel, the America's involvement and its allies, whether that's Britain, France, or whichever nation, has really escalated the scale of destruction.
I lived in Yemen for a very short time, but I lived through 2 civil wars. And in a civil war, people don't blockade themselves. It makes no sense, right? They don't target their own agriculture or food production sites or water plants. They don't destroy the infrastructure, because then they're going to be affected by that too. If they destroy the roads and bridges, well, they can't drive on those roads and bridges either. They don't cause this famine play games with the central bank, because it's going to affect everybody, right? And so there's this limit to the destruction in a civil war, usually, and at least in the context in Yemen, for sure, there's been a limit to the destruction. And eventually people come together and they forge new deals and the problem is solved. And that's what Yemenis were about to do before the Saudi-led intervention began. Now enter Saudi Arabia, the UAE, with intelligence support, logistical support, arms from basically the rest of the world, right? US, UK at the forefront of those countries. And And you have people with no, I mean, the US doesn't have soldiers on the ground. We talked about this earlier. There are no US veterans to the Yemen war, despite the US's involvement in Yemen. And so when you don't have soldiers on the ground, there's no risk of US civilians or Saudi civilians or Emirati civilians, then really the Yemeni civilians you've seen have paid the price, because it's a unilateral kind of, attack on this country. And so absolutely, US involvement has made things much, much worse. And so has UK and other countries' involvement in this war.
Iman, you've been patiently waiting there. I want to know more about what you're doing with your movement. Obviously, the ultimate extreme and actually very difficult act to carry out a hunger strike. People call it non-violent, it's violent to your own body, but other people are going hungry too, of course, in Yemen, and that's why you're doing this. Tell us more about the movement and what else you've been doing to try and advocate for peace.
Oh my God, I'm going to get emotional. At what extent do you feel so hopeless that you have to use your physical body to ask for the bare minimum? And I really connected with what, Shireen and Aisha said, because, we're Yemeni women, and we only have so much power. So our agenda is very strong. Our voices are very strong in that sense that we put so much of our bodies and so much sacrifice into our into what we say and what we do. I feel so violated. This hunger strike has been such a violation of my physical body, and just to try to imagine what people in Yemen are going through, because they don't have a Target nearby, they don't have a CVS nearby that they can, replenish themselves. So, I found a lot of power in the movement. I found a lot of solidarity in the movement, and so much support, and in this connection, in this network that we've made. There have been people that that oppose and call us biased, but I think when you have such a strong movement, which is what this hunger strike has been doing, as well as the support of Yemen Foundation and Shireen and Jumaan and everybody involved who've been working tirelessly in this, you beat back those people that are opposed to what you're doing. And so I'm sorry, I don't know if I fully answered your question, but that's kind of been the struggle through this, is to put this at the forefront of the world, and what we continue to do. Sorry, there might be some voices.
I'm gonna come back in a moment about going from being what probably felt like being a solitary voice to connecting with all the others. But before that, just as the film takes us, right into the heart of a hospital and focuses on the very human, utterly devastating impact it's having. In fact, I wrote down one of the quotes from Dr. Ida, which says, they have one thing in common, these people, and that is malnutrition and heartbreak. I'm going to ask you all, if you're willing to tell us about and share with the audience some of the stories that you are hearing from your loved ones, friends, relatives. I know you have, either close family and relatives or extended family and friends in Yemen on the ground who are effectively stuck where they are. They can do nothing about it. Can you tell us about that? And before I ask you, actually, I just want to say about what Jihan Hakim, who couldn't join us, told me, and that is that she said that it's quite devastating because often you don't know even if you're going to get to speak with them, because communication lines go down. And sometimes when you do finally get through, they might not have water or electricity, so maybe they might not be able to charge their mobiles to speak to you. And of course, there's also the fear that next time you call, they may not be there to pick up the phone. Aisha, I'm going to come to you first. Can you tell me about just a few examples of the experiences of people on the ground and what they tell you that they're going through?
Yeah, there are quite a few actually. I'll start with the largest bomb that was dropped in Fajatan. That's where my parents' home is. I woke up, like many Yemeni-Americans and Yemeni outside Yemen, it was a nightmare even going to sleep. For the first few months, it was very hard to sleep because I was afraid if I slept and I didn't get a message from Yemen, something would have happened. So when that bomb was dropped in my parents' neighborhood where my parents live, all the communication in the neighborhood were gone. So I couldn't reach out to them. And yet I was getting a lot of messages from Yemen, from friends and family asking me how my parents were. It was a very difficult time. By the time I was able to hear from them, it was over 12 hours. And they knew that I was calling them constantly whenever I was able to get through. So I learned that they were fine. There was a lot of physical damage. And thank God, my mom was a little hurt. So, and it got to a point where I couldn't believe anymore what they told me because I thought they were hiding things from me. They didn't want to scare me. And so with whatever they were telling me just to make me feel good. And that was very challenging. Because I realized I'm being a burden on them because instead of supporting them, they were trying to figure out a way to make me feel good in the middle of all that they are experiencing. So again, the struggle with that was quite real. The other part of it is my sister, she passed away from cancer. She needed medicine that was no longer available in Yemen. And to try to get that medicine to her was an ordeal because of the blockade. We had to get it from Egypt to Djibouti to Sana'a. By the time it got there, Jamila didn't need it anymore.
Aisha, I'm so sorry to hear that.
But that's one story of millions of stories. Jamila, may she rest in peace, was the lucky one. She had a family that could afford to get her medicine from outside Yemen. There are a lot of people in Yemen who cannot afford that. I've been trying to get leukemia medicine to Yemen for over a year. We've had a donation to cover every leukemia child in Yemen for a year. And because of the blockade, we can't get it. I get families sending me pictures of their kids because they think if I see their kids, I'm going to make a miracle and get a medicine in. We've had people send us pictures of families eating leaves, bitter leaves, because that's all they can afford. And actually, it's one of the areas that the movie shared in Aslam, where Nurse Makia is. That's all they had were bitter leaves to cook. So luckily for us, we had contacts in the area and we were able to be the first people on the ground to distribute food baskets to, I think we distributed about 500 at that point in time. But I mean, every story I tell you, there are millions similar to it. So I want people to recognize the magnitude of these stories. It's not just one person, it's a lot of people.
Of course, exactly. And I thank you for sharing those intimate details. And what is striking, of course, is that, as you say, it isn't just anecdotal. This is happening again and again, time and again, right across Yemen, and also the knock-on effects. So in the film, the nurse Mekia that you mentioned says that the children that aren't dying from malnutrition might die from the bombing. But of course, now you point out, because of the blockade, there's other health conditions or or treatments that are needed for health conditions that aren't getting to people. Shireen, can I turn to you and ask you if you, and feel free to say no, if you'd like to share with the audience anything that you are gleaning from your loved ones in Yemen?
Yeah, I mean, what Aisha said resonates a lot. In many ways, our families are the lucky ones because they have somebody living outside of Yemen who can wire, some money, and they can go to the store and, go to the market and get food or whatever they need over there. So despite that, many have been affected. Some of my cousins, one of my cousins, her house was bombed. And as they were leaving in the ambulance in Hodeidah, the ambulance was being targeted as well. And that's something very common in Yemen. I remember one time during the offensive of Hodeidah in 2018, when the UAE led this offensive to try to just fully occupy the port of Hodeidah. And, if you shut down the port of Hodeidah, you shut down food and access to 70–80% of Yemenis. And this was something that the US was backing at the time as well. And I remember texting my cousin, one of my very close cousins, I grew up with him, considering him a brother, and he's like kind of my contact in Yemen, who gives me his time. And I realized he was doing what Aisha said her family was doing, is that he's trying to figure out ways to make me feel okay about what was going on. So I remember one time there was an airstrike and I was like, this seems close to where he is. And so I texted him and I said, are you okay? And he said, oh yeah, it's pretty far away. Don't worry. Like, we heard something in the background, but it's pretty far away. And I just didn't believe him. And so I looked it up on Google Maps and it was a 10-minute drive. And it was like a 10-minute drive. And he's telling me it's so far away. We're okay. We're safe. There's nothing to worry about. And a 10-minute drive here, something happens in the city over, people call us. Like, if something happens in Michigan, I remember when coronavirus hit in Michigan, my contacts in Yemen were contacting me and saying, are you okay? Is everything okay? Do you have masks? Do you have this? Do you have that? And I'm like, you have nothing. And you're worried about me and what I have here in the United States. And yet when it's so close to them, there's this way for them to say, don't worry, it's fine. And I remember even that same cousin saying, hey, if it gets so bad, don't worry, we live by the ocean. I'll learn how to fish. And it just devastated me because there's this humor. They're trying to get on with their lives. And yet every day is an obstacle for them, like whether it's education or job prospects or, not knowing if they have enough to feed their families. Medicine, of course, is not an option. You just pray for them if something happens. And I think the saddest thing for me is, like, when my grandma passed away in 2016, I was grateful that she didn't have to suffer anymore, So.
Shireen, thank you. Thank you for sharing. And of course, as I ask these questions, because I know that hearing your testimony will have an impact on the people watching. And as a journalist who has dedicated her career to trying to uncover injustice, those are the questions that I am compelled to ask. Iman, I want to ask you, is the people that you're in touch with, your movement is in touch with, would you like to share what their experiences are?
Yeah, I think, just sort of similar to Dr. Aisha and Dr. Shireen, about a week and a half, I lost my great uncle to COVID, and I don't really talk very much about it, but it's been a very difficult reality to kind of keep in your mind when you're on hunger strike, and that the work is so intense. But I mean, we don't, when we talk a lot about the famine and malnutrition in children, and we just we don't talk a lot about how behind Yemen's healthcare was even before the start of the war, and just to kind of imagine my great uncle losing his fighting chance to COVID, and hearing Shireen's story about our family reaching out to us in the States asking if we're okay when COVID hit, when we knew that COVID was coming to Yemen eventually, and they wouldn't, they'd be devastated. And for us to, see our families drop, and lose so much of our heritage. I'm sorry, I was not expecting to cry, so.
It's okay. I'm going to ask you something different, actually, because you told me how striking it was that entering into the hunger strike, suddenly the change in terms of response to the movement and what you were calling for, and that you felt that really did have an impact. Can you tell us about the change in response that you've got, and who's reached out, and how you feel that you have made an impact by carrying out this hunger strike?
I think a lot of people really resonated with our message because we came to DC and we did not care about DC. We did not care about the lobbyists. We didn't care about keeping it politically correct or being polite, kind of like this, this politics of being polite all the time. We weren't doing that. We came in with a very strong message that wasn't being echoed or grown within the grassroots movements. And a lot of people resonated with that. And another thing too is that this has kind of been a process that has been built over since the war started, with the efforts of people like Shireen and Aisha and Jumaan. And we just started last year, and we kind of built off those movements, and when we sort of came together and continued to grow and spread the message against all odds, like literally against all odds. The shadow ban, the backlash, the lack of coverage. I mean, everything felt like everything was against us.
Do you feel the hunger strike has made a difference to the people that needs to hear and needs to take action?
It's brought, not only was the hunger strike, a form of pushing our demands, but it was an awareness campaign too. And a lot of people have come forward who didn't know about Yemen or didn't even know where Yemen was, or what the war was about.
Yeah, I know that Jihan was telling me that actually when she was advocating and going to, whether that's a congressman or woman or a senator to go and speak to, she would actually take the map with her, because a lot of lawmakers didn't even know where Yemen is, and yet there is the US participating and supporting this war. I want to move on. I'm conscious of the time. I know we have been given some leeway with the time, and I'm going to make full use of that while I have you all. With the announcement about Afghanistan from the White House and drawing down by September 11th this year, is there a hope that the mindset from the administration might change now as far as other conflicts are concerned, like Yemen, or do you think that we're just going to see more of the same contradictory behavior? We've heard that the war in Afghanistan is over before, but as far as Yemen is concerned, do you think the same is going to happen? Shireen, can you tell me about your view of whether there's going to be change as far as the US and Yemen is concerned?
Yes, sure. So one thing to note is President Biden was in the administration that began this war in Yemen. The Obama-Biden administration began supporting the Saudi-led coalition on the first day that it was announced. And they said that they're doing this in order to defend Saudi territory and sovereignty. And so it was a defensive war, as they put it, right? And here we, fast forward February 2021, President Biden made an announcement that he's ending offensive operations in Yemen. So made this distinction between offensive and defensive. Yet the war was always framed as a defensive war. So I'm not quite sure what that means. And said he would review relevant arms sales. And we've learned since then that those arms sales that were scheduled to be sold to the UAE have since been cleared to be sold to the UAE. He said that intelligence sharing has ended with the Saudi-led coalition, but there's no evidence of that. And in fact, Congress members wrote a letter saying, asking the Biden administration to detail exactly which operations have ended in Yemen and what is the proof. And so far we're 3 weeks past that due date, and the Biden administration has not only not provided evidence of ending US participation in the war in Yemen, but has actually come out and said that there is no blockade. So they are towing the Saudi line, so to speak, and denying the existence of a blockade when you have the country going into famine. And a recent CNN investigation showed, that there is a blockade, a fuel blockade, and the Saudis are saying, well, we've just let 4 fuel ships in, but there's no blockade, and the Biden administration is now parroting that line. And so what I worry about, and what I've always worried about with the Biden administration, despite what he was saying on the campaign trail, is that this is going to be a rebranding of the war. The US still has strategic interests in the area and still has its Saudi allies to appease, and still has hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapon sales and contracts that need to be continue to be flowing. And so I worry that this is, without intense pressure from all of us, that this is just going to be a rebranding of the war.
Right, and of course we don't have a member of Congress as part of the discussion to put that to, or someone from the White House, but I hear what you're saying. And I also know that Jihan was telling me that she really strongly believes that if America takes a stand and admits there is a blockade, or stops selling arms and ammunition to the Saudi government, that the other allies involved will also do the same. Of course, I'm British, and there are stories here about arms sales from Britain to Saudi Arabia, and there are fears that that is being used in Yemen. Do you believe that will happen? Aisha, I'll come to you for that.
When the Biden administration announced that they're going to stop the offensive support for the Saudi war in Yemen, I was actually pleased. At least there was an acknowledgement at that point in time. And I reached out to so many people in Yemen from different parties in different areas, and was sharing the news, very happily. None of them believed that. Not a single person I contacted in Yemen believed that. The message I got from everyone is, we'll believe it when we see it. We believe in actions, we do not believe in words. And so after, this was in February, and fast forward to today, I realized that they are wiser than I am. The fact that they did not believe a promise, a political promise, the fact that they said we need actions, not words. In a way, what they said is true. With the announcement of the plight from Afghanistan, this is not to happen until September. So I'm not sure what's going to happen between now and September, and what else that they're going to do. Are they going to continue the drone strikes? Are they going to, so are they going to continue having the contractors there? So there are a lot of things with a lot of these promises. I've learned my lesson now. I'm not going to believe any promise unless it's associated with action, unless I see the US doing something about ending the war and ending the support to the Saudi, whether it's, the military part or the blockade, then I would believe it. From now on, I need actions, not words.
Dr. Al-Adeimi, do you believe that it really is the US that needs to take this stand? And if the US does so, things will change and shift?
So 75% of the Saudis' weapons come from the United States, and about 25 or so from countries like the UK and Canada and the rest. And the day that Biden announced that he's reviewing relevant arms sales, Italy stopped all arms sales to the Saudi-led coalition. And so there is this diplomatic pressure that the United States has. And there is this repercussion that we see, like, this domino effect. When the US takes a certain stance, then other allies can feel pressured directly or indirectly. We're calling for direct pressure. Get on the phone with Boris Johnson and tell him to also stop selling arms supporting the Saudi-led coalition, for example, right? And it's not just arms sales, it's intelligence. Like the British and the American commanders are helping them choose targets. They are helping them. They used to help them up until 2018 to refuel midair. They provide servicing for their vehicles and their aircrafts. They train their soldiers and their pilots. And so it's not, it's like the Saudi-led coalition, I've said this before, is I think probably the most incompetent coalition we've seen in all of history, because you have these two extremely wealthy countries and all they have is money to spend. And you have the rest of the world supporting them, the US, the UK, and the others. And yet all they've caused is civilian deaths, hundreds of thousands, the destruction of the country of Yemen. They resort to blockades when they can't, get to people by bombing, right? And so you've seen this cruelty and this escalating kind of destruction, but they're still incompetent and they're still reliant on US intelligence and support and services. And I really do think that if the US stops, then first of all, they've got a problem because they don't make any of their weapons and they don't train their own soldiers and whatnot. And then also because of the US's influence in the world, they could potentially see others pull out.
Thank you. I guess the ultimate question from this discussion has to be, what do you all want to see happen? If you could make one appeal to people watching today and the people watching later, watching a recording of this, Iman, first to you, what do you want to see happen now? And what can people at home watching, wherever they are in the world? I know that your movement has connected with so many other movements around the world, but within America and outside, what can people do?
Well, the first thing we need to do is lift the blockade. And in order to do that, we need international support and we need national support here. So we need to get this in front of the world. We need people to uplift our actions. We need people to amplify our voices, and not just me or the YLMs, but including Aisha's and Jihan's and Shireen's voices as well. And specifically Yemeni voices who are in the front lines of the struggle. And so, people always ask us, what can we do to help you? And it's literally the easiest thing. Just share and support, retweet, repost, all of the things that we're trying to spread, so that way we can raise more awareness and get more actions towards ending this war.
And Shireen, do you want to tell us what, wherever people are, whether they're in Michigan, where you are, or California, New York, Kansas, Milwaukee, what can someone do sitting at home right now?
Thank you for that question. I echo everything Iman said. And in addition, this is our war. This is America's war in Yemen. And that's the first thing that people have to understand. And when they understand that, they need to do something. And I've seen this happen. When people understand this is a US war, they're like, well, no, I don't want this war to happen in my name, right? Because people in Yemen, they see Made in America bombs. They see the announcement on their of the wars, coming out of Washington, D.C. in 2015, and they know this is a US war on their country. But the opposite is not true here, not yet, right? And so I think people need to understand that, and then get on the phone with their elected officials, contact them. It's also the easiest thing to do with this war, because we're not asking for anything additional, right? We're not asking, please come save, throw all these resources and save Yemen and whatnot. We're just asking, stop the bombing, lift the blockade, right? You have no business destroying this country. Let Yemenis figure things out on their own. So I would encourage folks to apply pressure to their Congress people. Congress, when this was Trump's war, passed a historic war powers resolution as a result of all of our collective activism. And yet since Biden came to power, there's not been that push to end it legislatively, because this is illegal. In addition to being inhumane, it's illegal. The president has no jurisdiction to declare war, only Congress does. And so to pressure their Congress people to invoke the war powers resolution and force an end to the war.
Aisha?
I also echo what Iman and Shireen said. Call your representative, call your elected officials, tell them that we need to stop supporting the Saudi war and blockade on Yemen. One thing specifically I would like to ask is that we take the blockade off the negotiation table, meaning we de-link the negotiation for peace in Yemen from the blockade. The blockade cannot be used as a pressure point for any warring parties. The 30 million Yemeni people cannot be used as hostages to the negotiations that we know can take years and may not end up in any resolutions. The Yemeni people are not a bargaining chip for any nation to force any concessions from any of the warring parties. I think the blockade needs to be lifted, and that's what is our ask. And then the second thing is that we need to have a just peace that is very inclusive. I heard yesterday, the day before yesterday, Ambassador Linda Thomas at the UN talking about the war in Yemen as if and thanking the Saudis as if they were the mediators. And it struck me, if the US is thanking the Saudis that have led the war, it's called the Saudi-led coalition, and if they consider them a mediator, then we know the US is not impartial. So we already, if we're going to start going that route with the US that's not impartial, thanking the Saudi that's leading the coalition and the war on Yemen, thinking of themselves as mediators, there is going to be no resolution to this, and there is not going to be any peace in Yemen. So we need a just and fair peace that is inclusive for everyone, and that the blockade is disassociated from any negotiations.
Aisha Jumaan, Dr. Shireen Al-Adeimi, Iman Saleh, and in absentia, Jihan Hakim. I thank you all for participating in this discussion. Certainly, I've learned a lot. I hope the audience, whether in the United States or around the world, thank you for joining us, because of course that is why we've all done this and donated our time. And these women, Yemeni-American women, are volunteering. They all have day jobs. They volunteer their time and work together and coordinate together to try and raise this awareness, educate us, and so we can know more about what's going on in our world, and in particular for this cause in Yemen. You can go to the Hunger Ward website, hungerward.org, if you want to donate to the 2 clinics that were featured in the film. And of course, you can turn to WFP and other resources, and the Yemeni Alliance Committee, Aisha Jumaan's relief work, and of course the Yemeni Liberation Movement. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for participating, and thank you to Sky Fitzgerald for inviting me for this discussion.